Okay, I feel like we've done our necessary amount of time, and we can also give people, we'll start off with our introduction and give people a minute to get there at that point. But I want to welcome everyone to this Placer AI webinar, Omnichannel. What does it mean for retail real estate? This is one of my favorite topics, and I was really thrilled to be able to dive into this for two reasons. One, just the topic, and the second, because of my guest, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. But the agenda for today. So we're going to do a really quick introduction to Placer data for those of you who are new. We're going to do a quick section looking at the latest data from January and a little bit looking back beyond that. And then we are going to dive into Omnichannel specifically. And as always, we are going to leave time for a Q&A. And I saw someone come in with a volume challenge. We will do our best to speak loudly. If there's a challenge, maybe it could be on your end, but we will do our best to project. I again super excited today to welcome our guest Megan Martindale, head of retail research at Madison Marquette. Megan, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm excited about our conversation.
Yeah, so the teaser to this is Megan and I got deep into this conversation, and then we were like, wow, this is a topic we need to cover because it's something that I think both of us feel a tremendous amount of passion for as a key future element of how retail real estate is evolving. I want to start off with a really quick introduction to Placer. So what is the data you're going to be seeing today? Placer observes a panel of 30 million devices throughout the United States. Very critically, this is all anonymized aggregate data. We then utilize that data those devices as a panel upon which to run machine learning and AI algorithms. And we make estimations on visit trends to any retail location anywhere in the US. And we present that in a range of different reports within our platform on everything from visit counts, the customer journey, demographics, void analysis, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested and hasn't had a chance to try out, there is a free version of our premium product at placer.ai that you can sign up for. There's also a section called the Square, which is the home of our free tools that there we go. And then that you might be able to check out and find some value from. Sorry, we're trying to just see if there had been some sound quality issues. So we're just making sure that was solved. And now into the data. So we'll start with kind of like this really near-term look back, Megan. And kind of the first thing that was really interesting to us was the difference between what we saw in many retailers in that first week or two of January, as opposed to what we had seen in November and December. So Best Buy up much higher than they had been over the holiday season. They had been pretty holiday dependent. By the way, this bookending of the holiday season with huge growth in October, huge growth in early January was really interesting. But we saw many brands that saw increased traffic in early January, likely driven by returns. We saw a lot of online shopping, earlier shopping than normal, et cetera. Are there any key takeaways from this behavior? And how do you see these kind of smaller opportunities playing a role in this current retail environment?
No, I think there's a couple things at play. I mean, we've obviously had record retail sales again, and with that's going to come record returns. There's a lot of stats out there about what we're expecting for the return window. What's interesting, though, in looking at the data here is when we talk to our retailers and we're looking at traffic at our shopping centers, we actually had most of our retailers say that they saw less return activity that last week in December and then the first couple of weeks in January than they normally would. And I think there was a couple things at play between, Omicron, the weather. There's still supply chain issues, which is a big factor in returns, because if I'm going to go back and return a gift, but what I want isn't available yet, and it's available next month, I'm probably going to come back. A lot of retailers have extended those return windows. So you have kind of all of these dynamics at play where I think just like we had the shopping season pulled forward into October, I think we're going to have the return season pulled later, through Q1. But from a traffic standpoint, because we saw the same pops at some of our shopping centers, I would say, okay, if we're seeing a pop in traffic, but we're not yet seeing that same level of returns quite hit. One of the things that we're seeing across our portfolios, we're seeing a lot of gift card redemptions. We're seeing a lot of like promo sales. So it's not to say that a piece of that wasn't returns, but I think, we're going to have this kind of elongated return season, just as we had the elongated shopping season.
That's super fascinating and not something I had thought of, but yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I do think we're going to see this retail pop in February, especially
Yeah.
with Omicron cases finally looking like they're normalizing. I think with that in mind, there are two segments that we had been talking a lot about. We're finally into a pretty solid place. It's especially important quarter for certain segments like fitness, and then Omicron hits, and it's like, this is not a good situation. So dining and fitness were two of those big segments for us that we felt like they were rising. They were in this really impressive recovery, and then Omicron kind of shook those both sectors up again. Which of these two do you feel more optimistic about, and why?
So I'm optimistic and hopeful, I should say too, that 2022 is going to be the big bounce back for both sectors, but we need that consistency. We can't keep having these setbacks of obviously all the variants and everything going on. I think coming into January, even Omicron aside, I'm probably more optimistic about fitness, and for two reasons. One, in the dining sector, outside of QSR and fast casual restaurants, we obviously saw that big hit again to traffic and sit down and fine dining. We were really robust in seeing restaurant activity in Q4 and kind of that first few weeks in December, especially with like holiday parties and venue rentals and, everybody celebrating again. And then Omicron hits. The challenge, though, why I think winter is going to be so tough for restaurants is, they're also getting hit really hard by supply chain. They can't get certain products. They're being hit by inflation. So the stuff they can get, is at much higher prices. And then the labor side, obviously the labor issues is huge in the restaurant industry. And it's both, just the need to hire, but then it's also with so many staff members, getting Omicron. So it's just been this like perfect storm of, and then the weather too, so that impacts outdoor dining in so much of the country. So I think it's a tough winter for those, sit down kind of fine dining categories. Fitness obviously impacted by Omicron, of course, and the traffic data shows it. But, if you think about it, fitness is less supply chain dependent. If your gym is built and you can get cleaning supplies, you have what you need to operate. And we saw this huge Q4 pop in memberships and attendance and, people really coming back to the gym. And so, yeah, that's going to wobble a little bit, through the end of December and January. But I also think what's exciting about fitness this year, we're living these hybrid lives, but people want to get back to the gym. It's like, this is the first year I think resolutions have come back, right? Some people were really disciplined and really leveled up their fitness at home and bought the Peloton and doing digital and the apps and everything else. Most didn't. I mean, that quarantine 15 is a very real thing. So people all of a sudden this year were like, hey, we want to get back, we want to get back to the gym. But I think one of the interesting things to watch is the gyms, and whether it's boutique fitness studio all the way up to the big gym operators, is how they're adopting this sort of hybrid model now. Some days I want to go to the gym. Some days I want to do something virtual in a class with my community in the tribe. Sometimes I need it on demand because I'm traveling. So how are the gyms now going to adapt their models that we saw, this quick pivot in the restaurants last year between delivery and curbside and all of that? I think that's now going to really sort of reinvigorate the gyms this year, both from a demand standpoint, but then also knowing that sometimes people are going to want to be at the gym and then sometimes they're still going to be working out at home.
I agree with you. I think this kind of hybrid utilization of different fitness options is really important. It obviously speaks to the advantage of the cheaper gyms, let's call it, or the more value oriented gyms like a Planet Fitness or Blink. But there is this idea that I want multiple things. I want my Peloton at home, but I want to be able to go to the gym, and I like my Soul Cycle class. And I think this whole packaging out and this less direct competition is a really important element for the space. I do want to clarify, if any, we're seeing some hand raises. If anyone has a question, please throw that into the chat or throw that into the Q&A, and we'll make sure to get to it. Another area that we've been really fascinated by is kind of the city recovery, because I think this is another one of these things that felt like we were on a really healthy path, and then Omicron clearly has a significant impact. And like hybrid work, the migration away from cities that we saw throughout kind of much of the early parts of the pandemic clearly created concern. I think it was a legitimate concern, but it does appear like this urban living, urban retail, urban office environment could be really significant. How do you see this specific recovery unfolding?
Yeah, and I feel like I have to disclose that I'm a migration statistic. So we moved from New York City to Los Angeles at the end of last year. And it was for all of the cliche reasons of, after a decade in the city, wanting more space and not having to rely on the subway and being close to family and quality of life. And so, In all fairness, I am a migration statistic, but I also moved back to a city and state where more people are leaving than probably moving to. So I can kind of argue both sides of the fence. But that aside, I'm actually really bullish on the urban recovery. And I will tell you that, we were in New York City and Manhattan all through COVID. And in the depths of despair in 2020, I wasn't as optimistic about the recovery. But, coming out of it now and, with vaccinations and seeing, we've had some false starts, right? We were just getting back to the office. We were seeing this huge influx back into New York City, specifically last summer, especially driven by a lot of like the younger millennials and Gen Z, because you still could get more affordable rents. And then Delta hit, and then that kind of derailed for a while. And then we were coming back in October, and then Omicron hit. So, we've had some false starts, but if you still look at the trend lines, even here showing in traffic, that office reoccupancy is still improving. We get setbacks with variants, but it's still improving. And, I think there's certainly going to be some sectors that really easily adapted to remote and will stay remote or can stay hybrid, big tech and some of the other ones. But there's still a lot of sectors that there's a legitimate call for the return to the office. So when you think of finance and Wall Street, and you think of banking or anything has a lot of regulations to it, the consulting firms, that are really client facing. You look at law firms, you're in the middle of a big case. It's really hard to collaborate and research and prepare virtually. We've all done it out of necessity, but I think a lot of those key, and even life sciences, you have to physically get back into a lab. So because we see such a big component of the office population in New York City, for example, from those sectors, I think they're going to come back. It's just that delay of those demand drivers and how it's impacting, the retail landscape. And the other component is the travel. I mean, if you look at our big cities, especially New York, we're so travel dependent. And we saw first domestic leisure, but we still need to get business and international travel back to really get back up into, an occupancy and sort of GDP levels at the city level.
I agree with you completely. I also think this idea that, even in big tech, like there's going to be a big office component.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to go away. We always hear kind of the rumblings of the companies that have been like, oh, you never need to come back to the office, for the next little bit. They're the ones who are buying up office space. They understand that there is a real value that offices provide. It doesn't need to be 5 days a week, but it still needs to be there, and it needs to be kind of suitable. I agree with you completely on that analysis. But now to the main course, the topic that I love more than any other. Amen. Omnichannel. And let's start off with kind of table setting here. How do you define omnichannel, and why do you think it's important?
So there's sort of that traditional definition, right? Where omnichannel is this connected purchase journey, and it's integrating all of those silos that used to be operated as singular multi-channels. And obviously that's very legitimate. And we've seen omnichannel evolve, right? So the first iteration was stores and catalogs, and it was stores and e-commerce, and then it was apps, and now we're into, live commerce, and eventually we'll be buying in the metaverse, and, all these new channels that have opened up. But for me personally, and the way I'm thinking about it, because this directly impacts what we're going to get to on the implications for real estate, I think there's two other components, which is sort of that omni serving of the customer, because at the core of it, no matter where a customer is shopping, you're still having a human interaction. Now, whether that human interaction is me as a consumer digitally or me face to face with someone in a store, you have to be thinking about it holistically. And the other piece of this that, we're obviously seeing a lot of fintech innovation on is just the actual commerce, like that omni-commerce component for payments and buy now, pay later, and, getting into biometrics and voice purchasing and things like that. So I think, omni-channel, that initial sort of idea of it was just connecting the channels, but now we're even evolving past that of how do we do that? And if I look back, 5 years ago, there was a lot of retailers who were already doing it really well. Sephora and Starbucks and Nike and Disney, all these brands were already sort of in that omni-channel game. But I would say that most retailers 5 years ago were still trying to figure out their e-commerce platform, and it was more aspirational. And then last 2 years, it became imperative, right? And the thing that we've learned the most is that omnichannel has become that bridge between physical and digital. That omni-channel consumer is more valuable than a single channel consumer. And there's a lot of retailers are giving their stats. Neiman Marcus said, their omni-channel customers are 4.5 times more valuable than their single channel customers from a purchase and a loyalty standpoint. So, as we start to see this evolve, and we're going to have new channels opening up all the time, and we're starting to measure things differently, obviously, which I know we'll get into, we have to think about it holistically, that it's not just the focus on the actual channel, but it's that sort of holistic ecosystem that exists now.
Yeah, I mean, that was really well laid out. One question that did come in is all the data you're seeing now is visits to actual locations. I think one of the challenges that we're going to get into is how do you measure this? And one of the challenges is you have a lot of companies. I think we're pretty darn good at the offline data piece. The online data is an entirely different animal. So there is this kind of, but we'll go into that a little bit more of like how do you measure this? I wonder if you think there are like what are like the key foundations or like the an omni-channel strategy. And by the way, whatever terminology you like for this. So our friend Steve Dennis likes harmonized retail, which I think is a great way of viewing it. Like it's more like this is the concept. When you think about that, what are like these are the musts for an omni-channel strategy, those kind of core pillars?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I would answer it two ways a little differently, depending on if you're talking about a retailer's omni-channel strategy versus how now we're thinking of omni-channel strategies in the shopping center space and the landlord space. But at the heart of it, it's the same thing. It's consumer, right? So it's customer focused, and that has to be physical and digital, and how you're marrying those two. It's, and then to me, the other, and I'm completely oversimplifying it, but the other big balance is how you're complementing the physical and the digital, right? So consumers are buying anywhere, anytime, everything, right? We're all doing it. But we still like to go back into the store and have the experience. But sometimes we need the convenience of, I bought it online, I'm getting it shipped to my house, or I need curbside, or I need buy online, pick up in store, or hey, guess what? I'm on social media a lot more now because I've been home a lot more, and now I'm starting to buy through Instagram, and my children are into gaming, and I'm being introduced to what the metaverse is. So there's all of these different channels, but the core of it, it's all about the consumer, because that consumer both engagement, the traffic that's coming across all channels, and then that service level is what's obviously driving the purchases and the loyalty and all of that. And, one of the interesting ways that I'm thinking about consumers now, and I know a lot of retailers are, is we used to think of clicks, right? So it was the click of buying something online, or it was the click of a old school store counter, or now it's, the click of a ping on a cell phone in a shopping center. But, now it's really viewing the customer more as a wallet. They're spending their money everywhere. So how do we capture that, and how do we stay sort of in their wallet of their spend on essentials, on discretionary, on experiential, on all categories? Like, how do we meet those demands? Because you can't really think of it in the separate silos anymore.
I mean, I agree with you. I think the fascinating thing is you think about how long we've said we put the customer at the core as like kind of this key premise of retail. And then you recognize that we probably haven't for the last, decade or two, because we've said there's this channel and there's this channel, and you'll see which one you interact with and you deal with you differently in each one. And this is the challenge now, to understand that the customer is no longer bound by any single way of interacting with you, and they expect you to be consistent, authentic across those channels and integrated across that, which I think is maybe the biggest challenge. I think one of the things that we talk about this a lot from the retailer perspective. I know that we haven't, at least us, we're guilty of this. We don't talk about this enough from the real estate perspective and what it means. And so I wonder, like, in the simplest question, like, what does omnichannel mean for retail real estate in the broadest terms?
Well, I think the first piece of it is, it's just the logistics side of it, right? The functional, the operational side of it. So, we've seen this huge shift in how we're operating, how retailers are operating their stores, and then how we're operating our shopping centers to meet the rise in curbside and buy online, pick up in store, and, the different parking needs. And, so from an operations standpoint, you can see the physical impact of omnichannel. From a data standpoint, one of the impacts that we are seeing, and that we're working on now with the rise in curbside, for instance, as one channel, is we've seen that impact our dwell time. It doesn't always register is super significant. We've seen it anywhere from, if you look at the data, 3 minutes to a 10-minute impact to dwell time over 2019, before curbside was this, huge growth in huge growth in the curbside service. So, we're looking at how the physical changes to the real estate to accommodate omni-channel sales, especially when you're looking at the fulfillment of online sales in store, where we can actually see how that's impacting our traffic, right? But on the flip side, we are also starting to see new models emerge, that we are working on to take sort of the positives of omni-channel and how we're looking at our social media engagement, web traffic, and the implications that's having on our physical traffic and our physical sales.
Hmm. That's super interesting. I wonder if how does it change the way that you look at a shopping center, you develop a shop? Obviously, I think if you could create one from scratch now, there's things that you hadn't considered 10 years ago that you're like, well, we need a buy online, pick up in store area. We might want to figure out how to make upsell a component of that. Like, is there like a new way of viewing the shopping center as in light of this shift?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I'll add on before I go into that you mentioned about the consumers and kind of being at the heart of retail. I think the difference is now, 10 years ago, it was a philosophy that consumers had to be the heart of retail and the heart of omnichannel, right? Everybody was talking about it. Yes, of course, in theory, we get this. The difference is now, 10 years later, we have a decade-long track record through a pandemic when omnichannel became so imperative of data to see how that materialized, to see what worked, what didn't. Everybody says test, learn, measure, fail fast, pivot. The agility was what really the foundation of retail has been the last couple of years. So as we're now looking at either existing operating shopping centers or building or developing or remodeling or remerchandising shopping centers, we have that data now that we can really look at. And so we have no one has the answer to this. Everyone is trying to figure it out, and we'd like to think that we've rolled up our sleeves and we're diving into it daily. We've got an amazing team, and by the way, this takes a lot of talent. This takes a lot of brain power in the room to figure this out. So we're looking at new models for our real estate, and we say, okay, the old model of leasing and how you drive your value is sales, and you take sales and you apply a health ratio, and you have an occupancy cost, and that's going to drive your valuation and your pro formas and everything else in your operational budgets and things like that from a shopping center. Well, we're looking at it now. We're taking an omni-channel view of our shopping centers now. So it's not just the retailers are doing this, landlords need to do it too. So we still have to maintain that physical environment, right? And we have to know that we're going to generate those sales out of the physical space. And it's still, we're coming out of a pandemic, so it's still maintaining it for safety and cleanliness and all the things that consumers want to see. But we've also seen this big resurgence in experiential and, events and activations. All of that stuff's back. Yes, we have some blips with variants, but in general, that's back and it's coming back. So we know that piece. We understand how to model that. Where we've come into new territory and what we're working on now is we've actually built a model where we can say, okay, let's look at our omni-channel. So that starts with engagement for us, digital engagement. So it's social media. So it's looking at impressions and followers and all of that back-end data. And if we've been modeling our social media engagement, we see a direct correlation to our web traffic. So if I see something really cool on Instagram from one of our retailers or one of our shopping centers, the next step for me is usually, well, I'm going to go to the website and see where this shopping center is and what their hours are. And when is this cool event that they're doing? How do I get there? Right? So we can see that direct correlation. And from the time we implement, our social media strategies, it's usually a 90 to 120 day window where we can really start to measure a demonstrable impact on web traffic. About 30 days later, that kicks into physical traffic at our centers. We can actually measure that correlation. It follows the trend line of social media engagement to web traffic to physical traffic. And then that next piece of it is now the sales traffic. So overlaying the sales data on there, and we can actually see those trends and how they're influencing each other. And, we're obviously doing this at the shopping center level. And if retailers aren't already, they should be doing it at the actual store level so that we can come together and say, okay, XYZ retailers in our shopping center, here's the data and here's how they're measuring that online offline integration and their omni-channel metrics. we can combine that with our omni-channel metrics at the shopping center level. And it takes that transparency and it takes that collaboration. I don't think we're totally there yet. But when we get there, that to me is where we're going to come up with these new pricing mechanisms and how we're sort of seeing the new value of real estate going forward.
It's such an important kind of area for discussion, and I think one of the maybe the biggest reasons why is the challenge of the measurement is not just, it is clearly a major shopping center problem. How do you show the value? And like, so again, my background is in an online data company, and one of the things that always blew my mind was how little online cross shopping there was between major brands in the same sector, and how so much of the discovery process was offline or in non-digital channels. I guess TV is not a digital channel, and I think one of the really fascinating things was retailers are struggling with this too, because you're trying to tell your staff in a store, give people the best possible experience, even though they might not buy a thing in your location, but your staff members like, all right, well, if I'm getting, some sort of bump for actually driving a sale, if it happens online, you're not giving me any credit for it.
Right.
There is this kind of real need to figure out how to connect these dots in a more effective manner. And I wonder, on the measurement side, we're being asked to view the customer at the center of this wide, really broad network of kind of experiences. How would you go about measuring this as a retailer? What are the principles you need to bring in to approach this?
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of, Warby Parker, and certainly, so there's obviously the sales, online sales, offline sales, and then where those intersect. And I think that to me is the critical piece, is that gray area, because it's very easy to say, these are the sales coming out of this store, these are the sales coming off the website. But we're starting to see retailers report on this more and more. Macy's was really good about reporting it with, we had this huge growth in online sales, but I think it was 25% of their online sales were fulfilled by the store. So to me, that's the missing link that we haven't, just as an industry, been measuring and focused on as much. I think that's obviously changed now in the last 2 years because we're seeing such growth there. So I think you have to look at sort of that hybrid sale, if you will, and really get your arms around how you measure that. And the other piece of it is exactly what you're showing, which is how are you expanding these trade areas? And I can tell you that, if I look at shopping center data and what we've been doing for our version of Omnichannel, I see the exact same thing where we're growing our trade areas. We're growing visits, we're growing loyalty, we're growing how far of a reach we have, because you have the ability to engage digitally with your consumers 365 days a year. You're not closed for Christmas, you're not closed for Easter, you're not impacted by snow, and so you can actually reach a much broader audience through digital channels. But then the focal point is, okay, but then how do we get them to come in and interact with the physical space? And you think about Warby Parker, when they first launched, they weren't doing vision services. It was like, I have a prescription, I go in, I can digitally try on, I can order what I want, you're in and out. And it was a true, direct to consumer experience. Well, you think of how many stores they've grown. Now they're expanding into that service component, because you think of the success of LensCrafters and all of the other providers, they had that service component. And at first, Warby Parker was really lacking that, and you see how much they've grown in the 12 years since their first physical store opened, and how they've changed that model as a way to bring more consumers in and broaden that reach, and then be able to measure where the sales are coming from it.
It's such an important point that it's one of the areas of Omni that we don't talk about enough. We do talk about this rising marketing value, and a great question came in, and we'll address it soon, talking about things like rising digital costs. That cost of the eyeball online is getting more expensive all the time. There is this element that the store as a platform, if you think digital, if I go to Warby Parker, I'm going with a very specific focus. If I walk into a Warby Parker, I don't know, you're selling visors too from some cool new, direct to consumer brand or formerly digitally native company, that all of a sudden makes sense. And so I think there is this concept that we're missing of, like, for a lot of these brands who recognize, why are they expanding so much? Because they know that that's their way to expand into other areas. Whereas online, you are the thing that you do well and you're known for. And it's much more difficult to kind of broaden that reach. I do want to go into kind of the brands you think do it well. So, I obviously have a deep and kind of unending obsession with Target as and anytime we do anything about who's doing it well, it's basically Target's part of my answer. But I think, who do you think does omnichannel well, and what can we learn from their success?
So I agree. I mean, I think Target has really raised the bar. Ulta, Sephora, Nordstrom, Bloomingdale's on the department store side. I think they're all doing it very well. One company that I am just so intrigued by, and I was talking to a friend about it this week, is Joybird. So they started, online. They opened their first brick and mortar stores. They had some false starts. They had some really bad press about availability of product, and everything showed up torn. And I think they've really improved that experience. And if you look at how they have integrated a really highly curated Instagram page, right, with their website, and driving the traffic from social to the website, they have a component on there that's like in stock today. So I know I can go to one of their showrooms and that couch is in stock today, and it's probably discounted. It's probably something somebody ordered and didn't fit, or they didn't like the color, right? And so now they're selling it off the floor. So they're bringing the traffic into the store. They have, 4 showrooms, Brooklyn, DC, LA, Chicago, I think it is. But then they're also really great about that customer engagement at home. So if I'm like, buying a piece of furniture is a big investment, and can be really intimidating, and it can be really frustrating experience. And a piece of furniture is still something you want to touch and feel and go sit on before you really make that commitment, for the most part. So you can say, okay, I'm looking at this couch model and I want to see the fabrics. They'll send you swatches. There's just this really high touch, sort of that research phase as you're going into the path to purchase. And then you can, if you live close enough, you can obviously get into a showroom. And I think the whole point is make it easy on the brands that are doing it best are making it easiest on the customer, from a convenience standpoint. But they're also really understanding and catering to the fact that you still need that really high touch human interaction. People want to touch and feel things. So yes, if they can't get into a store, how do we solve for that? We send them swatches. I mean, it's such a brilliant, easy fix to it, and a lot of these companies are struggling with it in real time. We see that. I mean, and negative reviews go viral, right? So you can see some of that negative side really easily. But when you really think about how complex all of this is to execute from the retailer standpoint, I think a lot of the retailers have really excelled, and they're just going to keep raising the bar. If we have this conversation 6 months from now, we're going to have a whole new cast of characters that have done it well. Some probably don't even exist today yet, that are in their infancy.
Yeah, it's a great point, but I think it really starts with understanding what is the solution you're providing to your audience. Like, we spoke to Melissa Gonzalez, who's big on the pop-up store space, and she spoke a lot about, this is a year ago, she spoke a lot about the idea of like, the store is a fitting room. Like, it doesn't have to be much more than that. And that's okay if that's the goal of your customer. They can go buy it online, they can have it sent to their house, but make sure it fits, and then cut that cost on, other places. I want to get to some of the questions because they kind of fit really nicely in here.
Mm-hmm.
It's 2 great questions from anonymous attendees. I was like, we'll make up a name, but maybe not. We'll just go with anonymous. So, have changes to IDFA and rising digital acquisition costs prompted any digitally native brands you've looked at to accelerate their store opening plans? So, I mean, Megan, I'm interested to hear your take. Our answer is 100% yes. Everybody is looking at store expansions or stores. Leap, a great company that does they'll take care of the process for you, just raised $50 million. You're seeing pop-up concepts in malls and, owned by those malls specifically, 100%. And the craziest story I heard was a company in the health space who had been online only, saying they recognized that operating hundreds of stores nationwide was going to bring them more eyeballs, solve more of their problems, and reduce their cost of acquisition dramatically, considering how expensive it was getting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, I'm glad to hear that from healthcare companies and sort of this, what used to be alternative kind of retail uses, because especially specific just to that category, health and wellness was such a big category pre-COVID. And now it's this holistic health and wellness and, proactive mental health and immunity. And, so what's the best way to engage with consumers and build that sense of community around that and that engagement? A lot of the time it's in a physical environment. Everyone has digital fatigue, So in addition to the fact that we're tired of doing things online, we want to get back to the stores. It, if the best thing that came out of COVID for me is it reinforced the value of the store. And you have new brands seeing the store in new ways, and look, I'm 22 years in the business, so I'm biased to physical retail, but, I want people in our shopping centers. But, I absolutely think that utilizing that physical store footprint and that expansion rate is going to continue with a lot of these new brands, but it's not the old model of physical retail. I think that's the big key. You can't apply a lease structure or how you would view the operations of a store from 20 years ago to what this next gen is. And to me now it's more like, we operated the last couple decades as, brick and mortar versus digital, and now we're looking at it more as like the technology deployed and the digital deployed in store. It's like digital bricks, right? It's not just brick and mortar versus a digital, it's that really coming together. And that has to be the forefront of how we're looking at these new store formats. And that's where they're seeing the value to me.
100%. I think it's even assuming it's like we were talking about returns at the start, the online return is so expensive. The offline return is cheaper, plus it has a bigger opportunity for upsell. I again come from a background of analyzing, bringing the same perspective that we do at Placer, but from a digital company. And it was shocking to me how, the retail apocalypse narrative walking into when I started at Placer, it's like, do you not see what's happening online? Do you see how low the conversion rates, how expensive it is to acquire users, how much that competition is increasing, who they're competing with? I think there's this weird lack of recognition of how powerful the store is. I do want to this is an interesting one. Maybe it's the same person, but another anonymous attendee says, how does Omnichannel impact the discount retail sector? Tenants like TJ Maxx recently adding an online presence. Does the treasure hunt mentality of consumers offset the impact of online convenience? I will start and then I'll pass to Megan because this is one of those that I really love. It doesn't have to be copy and paste of what Macy's or Nike or Lululemon do. It needs to be authentic. And so maybe the digital experience for Marshalls or TJ Maxx is a kiosk in the location that says, hey, you wanted a large of that shirt that they don't have that they only have in an extra large. Here's the other location that we can get it for you. Or you can actually click on this kiosk and we'll send it to your house from that location, or you can pick it up at the store. It doesn't have to remove the treasure hunt experience. It should complement it. It still needs to have a digital component, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the challenge, so the treasure hunt is the fun part, right? But the challenge to truly migrating that online as a purchase channel, other than engagement, like what you're talking about, and connecting with the consumers and, giving them sort of that online shopping pastime, right? That maybe you can't always get to a store for. The challenge there for the off-price channels is the inventory. Their inventory is very different than Macy's and Bloomingdale's that has very specific orders and units and stuff. They know exactly what they're ordering several seasons out. Well, a lot of the off-price stuff is the stuff that didn't sell or it was discounted, or, and a lot of times you don't necessarily know where that inventory is coming from. So that's the big challenge, like you said, is it's not that they can't replicate the experience in the treasure hunt online. It's how do you fulfill those orders? And that gets, really into the weeds on sort of real-time inventory and technology and, the analytics, because you know how it is. You see something at a Marshalls or a TJ Maxx or Home Goods, and this has happened to me, especially having just moved and furnishing a house. You're like, oh, I should buy that. Nah, I'll just go back and get it. Well, guess what? You can circle the store and go back and something's gone. Yeah. So imagine how fast that's happening if you're driving traffic online. So to me, the bigger issue is going to be, yes, you can engage, you can, sort of have that brand experience online, but I logistically can't figure out how these retailers will manage and meet the inventory demands when it's not as sort of systemized, if you will, or traditional as it could be for, other retailers. Gap knows how many jeans and white t-shirts they have coming in, but Home Goods that might not. So that, and with all the inventory and supply chain issues that we've had, I think that's part of the big challenge.
Yeah, I love that you call that. I've had a mini obsession with Gap over the last month and a half, and I can't stop looking into their data. I think it's absolutely fascinating. If anyone is bored and is a Placer user, go look at all the Gap brands. It's super interesting what's happening there. I want to talk about, it's interesting, we had the Burlington on the next slide. I want to, we have some great questions coming in that I do want to get to, but I do want to ask, like, when you think about like the future of Omni, you kind of break out your crystal ball. What does the future of Omnichannel look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's probably never going to be perfect, right? Because we're learning and changing all of the time. And I think look, we all hope another COVID doesn't happen, but we are going to have other disruptions. And if you think of how omni-channel evolved and accelerated and all the things that we've been talking about over the last 2 years, it was already happening, but it was sort of that black swan event, right? That made it happen faster and forced retailers into agility and adapting. So, I think we're going to continue, obviously, to see the innovation. There's a lot of talk of the metaverse. I'm not too bullish that happens this year for retail, but we're getting there. All the channels are going to evolve. All of that's going to happen. But to me, what's going to impact the future state of omnichannel the most is the thing that I don't know what's going to happen yet. It's what is that next big disruption? What is that next big consumer change? Or God forbid, it's another big global worldwide event. We certainly, none of us need that. But, we're kind of emerging from this, I think, in a really good place of bridging that physical digital gap. And a lot of the acceleration forced that last year. And a lot of retailers did that knee-jerk pivot of crisis mode response. Best Buy got curbside operating in 48 hours, right? So now the next iteration of omnichannel coming out of the pandemic and seeing how things have shifted is now elevating the quality of these services and sort of perfecting that model. And we were all in stores where they took out, racks and put up the lockers, or put up racks for buy online, pick up in store, and completely compromised the store experience. Well, now retailers are really coming back in and saying, okay, omnichannel is here to stay. We have to physically redesign our stores. They need to be more digitally, integrated, right? We need to be able to not compromise the physical showroom and experience inside the store because we're fulfilling digital sales, but we need maybe more back of house space to fulfill those sales. So, I think it's sort of kind of moving towards perfecting and bettering and sort of elevating where we are today. But to me, that next big disruption, whatever that may be, good or bad, is where we're going to kind of push ourselves into that next era.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I want to get to questions, so I'm going to skip some of the things. We had awesome ideas to discuss, but sadly we are running a little short. A question came in. So the average consumer uses 10 channels versus 5 to 3 years ago, according to an industry marketing resource. Which channels do you recommend? I'm going to add in the word most for brick and mortar retailers.
Look, I think it depends on the scale of the retailer. If you are an independent boutique retailer in a shopping center, you're going to have a very different approach and ability to scale than you are if you're a Target or a Best Buy or Home Depot or a big national brand, right? So I think the biggest thing is, how are you engaging your customers? So obviously that's the store experience and that physical experiential, store, right? But then it's also, how do you digitally engage through social media, through a website, through an e-commerce platform, whether it's your own or you're, with a marketplace or something like that. And then how you, like we've been talking about today, how you integrate those two. So one is not the sacrificial lamb of the other, right? They have to work together. And, we, outside of the big national tenants who have unlimited, resources to build these platforms, we've worked with a lot of our local tenants. We have like a pop up and grow initiative that we launched, which is fantastic. And we're incubating a lot of local artisans and marketplaces and things like that. And it can be as simple sometimes as, okay, you have the store, you put up a social media page, you get to a website. If you can't get to a website yet, you at least have social media. You expand that into a web platform. But a lot of these, retailers, and look, we're in that creator economy again, right? With the great resignation of work, we're seeing all these new startups, all these new companies, people following their dreams, starting the businesses. They're not going to all have those resources to just come in and say, I'm an omni-channel retailer and I have completely perfected every channel, seamless integration. They're not going to have that ability. In some cases, we're seeing this with a lot of tenants and retailers who are first-time operators, and you kind of have to figure out what's the most effective, efficient way to drive traffic both to my store and to my online channels. And to me, to oversimplify it, it's the physical store, social media, and website capabilities. And then you can start getting into social commerce, live commerce, metaverse, all these other things that are growing. And then keeping in mind that service and convenience component of, buy online, pick up in store and curbside and all of that.
It's a very good point. Last question, and we'll do this one quick. And thank you to Jeremiah, because this is one of the slides we had to skip. It says, I agree that you can't look at the customer in silos, and am skeptical of department stores separating e-commerce from brick and mortar, i.e. Saks Fifth Avenue. What's your opinion and prediction of this separation? Megan, you get to start.
Yeah, so I'm not a retailer and I'm not an activist investor. So I understand the intent behind it on many levels, which I won't go into, but I think it's a mistake. I think it sets us back. We have spent the last several decades, again, operating brick and mortar versus digital and e-commerce. We're finally emerging in this more holistic ecosystem of it. So to separate that out again, to me, is a big setback. But I'll tell you, the bigger issue for me, and I haven't heard anyone who can answer this yet, is the agility piece. So the agility of retailers the last 2 years was the foundation of their resilience and how quickly they pivoted. We talked about Best Buy, right? 48 hours, they launched curbside. How do those two companies stay agile? So when this next big disruptor comes, and it will, we don't know what it is, but it will, and you have to pivot your business and you have to change your model. It's hard enough for one retailer as an organization to make these big, systemic changes. So how do you have two different companies doing it? There was a stat that with the Saks split off, there were 340 service agreements that had to be negotiated and put into place to basically document processes of the physical stores versus online. Well, guess what? If we're in crisis mode and we're pivoting our operations and we need to be agile, but you have to know that all of those are speaking together and you're still controlling that customer journey, I'm skeptical about the ability to stay agile.
I think I'm paraphrasing Jason Goldberg's quote from last week when we had our webinar, who said, in his 30-year career is the stupidest decision he's ever seen, which I very much ascribe to. There was a lot of questions today about digitally native brands. If you are interested in that topic, I really recommend in 2 weeks, we do our next webinar. Look out for that email from us. It'll come in the weekly that gets sent out early next week. We have Gabby Yo from Fifth Wall, who sits on the board of a lot of these digitally native brands, super well versed in the real estate space as well. I could not recommend that one more as well. But I want to say, Megan, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. This is one of my favorite topics, and to do it with one of my favorite guests was just like the perfect treat. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, everybody.
And thank you all so much for joining. We really appreciate it as always. And look out in your email for the next one, which will be in just 2 weeks. Thank you for being here. Everyone have a wonderful day. And Megan, thank you again.